Good morning. Last time we looked at, I believe, four possible accounts of substance. There were two of Aristotle's. The first, that a substance is an entity that is capable of undergoing intrinsic qualitative change. And then Aristotle's account that a substance is that which is neither a set of a subject nor in a subject, which distinguished individual substances like Rover, Fido, and Spot from properties of individual substances, such as essences, particular qualities, and general characteristics that are accidental. Then we looked at the substratum and inherence theories, and we found problems with all of these theories. And we were about to begin on the independence account of substance. So you can find this in Descartes, René Descartes. So one of his formulations of this is that a substance is something that can exist without the aid of, all by itself. A substance is an entity that it can exist all by itself without the aid of any other substance. So one example of that, I take it, would be God would be such a substance according to Descartes anyway. So there's a statement of this in the text, Substance, Its Nature and Existence, on page 21. Descartes says, the answer is that the notion of substance is just this, that it can exist all by itself, that is, without the aid of any other substance. The problem with this analysis, as it's literally stated, is its blatant circularity, because it uses the notion of a substance to explain the notion of a substance. It says that a substance is something that can exist without the aid of any other substance. So if we don't know what a substance is, then this isn't going to help us understand what a substance is. Seems to be a very tight, vicious circle. So that won't work for that reason. However, he has another place where he states it somewhat differently. Here he says, by substance, we can understand nothing other than a thing which exists in such a way as to depend on no other thing for its existence. Now, if we understand the word thing there to mean substance, then we're just back to the same problem again. But we could understand thing there, if we're charitable, and we should be, as meaning entity or being. So then we would escape the charge of circularity there. So I'll put that one up. So by substance, we can understand nothing other than a thing which exists in such a way as to depend on no other thing, that is, entity, for its existence. So this is clearly an independence criterion of substance, because it says it doesn't depend, right, on any other entity for its existence. It's completely independent in its existence. It's a wholly autonomous entity in that it depends on no other entity for its existence. So Descartes' inviting us to conceive of the possibility of a single substance existing without any other entity whatsoever existing. Nothing exists other than that individual substance. So imagine God existing and nothing else before the creation, so to speak. God exists, but nothing else exists at that time. So God is an independent entity and as such a substance by this account. It's an independence criterion or definition or analysis of substance. All right, so let's explore how viable this account is. There seem to be lots of substances that won't be independent in this sense. Suppose God is an individual substance in Descartes' way of thinking. Of course, that's to assume a lot, right? But Descartes, in his day, it was natural to just assume that God exists. Descartes thought he could prove that God exists through various arguments he puts forward in the third and fifth meditations, for example. So the idea that I'm getting at is that if you take an individual substance other than God, say Adam and Eve, okay, clearly they depend on God for their existence, so they won't meet this criterion. So it doesn't seem like this is a necessary, this puts forward a requirement for being a substance, since there are substances that don't meet it. It's might be thought to be sufficient. If an entity is wholly independent in this sense, it'll qualify as a substance, but it doesn't seem that all substances must meet this definition. Descartes' well aware of that. He basically says about Adam and Eve that they need nothing else other than God in order to exist. So what he says is that they're dependent on God, but not on any other entity. So it seems that what Descartes' getting at is that there are two types of substances, which, for want of a better term, we can call basic substances and non-basic substances. God would be, for Descartes, a basic substance, and then Adam and Eve would be non-basic or derivative substances. So so it seems that this definition here is really a definition of which type of substance, the basic or the non-basic. It would be a definition of the basic substance, right? So we need another definition of a non-basic substance, and then we could put the two together and say that an entity is a substance if it's either a basic substance or a non-basic substance. So this is the definition of a basic substance. So X is a basic substance, i.e. God. By definition, which we write equal sign, letter D, letter F, period. So that's an abbreviation, meaning by definition. X is a basic substance is defined as, or by definition is, X does not depend on anything else for its existence. And then X is a non-basic substance. By definition, X does not depend on anything else for its existence except for God. And then X is a substance. X is either a basic substance or a non-basic substance. So God and Adam and Eve will all be substances. X is either X is either a basic substance or a non-basic substance. Okay. So this is one interpretation of what Descartes' account of substance is. There's still some room for criticism, I think, with this. I mean, if you think of God, is it really true that it doesn't depend on anything else for its existence? Well, yeah. Yeah, well, Descartes talking, or so you're asking which God is it depends on which God Descartes is talking about. Well, Descartes, we know which God he's talking about. So he's talking about the traditional God of the Judeo-Christian religion, the eternal, necessarily existing, all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good being. So, yeah, that's the one he's talking about there. Yeah, so there's a lot of baggage, right? But suppose we grant him that just for the sake of argument, without assuming that we can know or that there's very persuasive evidence that such a God exists. But perhaps it'd be fair to say that it's an open question whether such a God exists, given our finite intellectual capacities for discerning ultimate truths about the nature of reality. It's an open question. But Descartes makes that assumption. He's got some arguably fairly poor arguments to support the conclusion, but no one's able to disprove it either. So we don't know. Assuming that anyway, that there is such a God, then it doesn't seem to depend on any other substantial being anyway, right? But might there be insubstantial non-substances that the existence of God requires the existence of those things? Clearly, other gods would depend on other beings like you were suggesting. I mean, I take it that was your point. For example, Zeus depended on Kronos, was it? Oh, right. Yeah. But actually, within the mythology of the ancient Greek gods, I believe that Zeus was actually the child of previous beings. He killed his father in order to capture the throne of the god. I think it was Kronos. Yeah. Who was some kind of giant or something like that? Titan, that's it. Yeah. Right. So either way, right? Yeah. But it's going to turn out that these members of some kind of polytheistic pantheon of gods are going to be dependent on other substances. But the Judeo-Christian God allegedly is not. So Descartes would have to say that those are non-basic substances. Zeus and Athena and so on. They would be non-basic substances. They would depend on something else for their existence. And he'd say, well, there's some more or supreme God that exists, right, over them, the Judeo-Christian God. Yeah. Any other thoughts about that? I wasn't thinking along those lines. Though it's certainly fair to raise that question. I was thinking more along the lines of ontological matters rather than speculative religious ones. As noted, from the point of view of rational evidence, at least my rational evidence, all of these claims about God or gods are to some extent speculative, unless you have some direct revelation or unshakable faith. Right. It doesn't seem to be compelling evidence available to most of us, I think, or at least to me. I can speak to what other people may experience. They can decide, report on that themselves, right? So whether they have compelling evidence or not, or whether it seems to them that they do or not. So I was thinking more in terms of, does the existence of God seem to entail the existence of other entities? And I was thinking that it does for this reason, that God is associated with a number of divine attributes that I've already enumerated, such as omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection, eternality, necessary existence, and so on. So doesn't God entail the existence of properties or attributes, assuming that you're not a nominalist? If you're a nominalist, then I guess there are no attributes, so Descartes' in the clear. Descartes, I think, wasn't a nominalist, accepted the existence of perhaps Aristotle. He was certainly not an extreme Platonist. So believed in perhaps Aristotelian essences, like extension and thought, which he thought of as the essences of substances. Yeah.
But would it change this, I guess, equation at all if you just took God out of it? It would just be that X does not depend on anything else for its existence. And, what about the except for God bit? That would still leave the formula the way it is, technically. Right?
Right, but then we have the same problem for the table. Maybe it's worse for the table because it entails more than the existence of the table entails, or of the matter that composes the table, whichever. The existence of those things also entails the existence of properties like extension and solidity and massiveness, mass and size, shape, and so on. Right, and it entails also parts, which God doesn't entail. God doesn't seem to have parts, like a right foot and a left foot, because God's a holy spiritual entity, indivisible into any parts. But the table has lots of parts, and they seem to be separate entities from the table, like the top of the table and the legs of the table, so on. So now we've got the table entailing parts of the table and properties. The table may also entail the existence of space and time, which the existence of God, it seems, doesn't entail, at least the existence of space. It's debatable whether God's existence entails the existence of time. Traditional Orthodox theology says God's eternal in the sense of being outside of time. If that's wrong, which it may well be, then God may entail the existence of time as well. But it certainly doesn't entail the existence of space. God isn't a being that you can find, hanging out in a particular region of space. Right. So God may be exempt from entailing space or time, whereas a table clearly entails both. It seems you can't have a table, it seems, without space and time, or at least space. Again, maybe if the table was the only thing in the world and was completely static, there'd be no time. So maybe it's like the case of God in that way. But so anyhow, summing it up, God does not entail the existence of space, whereas the table does. And the table then also entails limits, spatial limits, like its surface must exist, boundaries, and so on. So, so we can't say that a substance is something that does not depend on the existence of anything else, or even anything else except for God. Or in the case of God, we can't say it's a being that doesn't entail the existence of anything else because it entails the properties of God, even though it may not entail the existence of parts and places and times. It seems to entail omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection, and eternality, and all sorts of other divine attributes. So we'd have to say that, so we'd have to take up a nominalistic stance. Or we'd have to say that somehow God's properties can't be distinguished from God, which would be very odd. That there's no, in the case of God, there's no difference between God and his properties. Some advocates of so-called divine simplicity maintain that. They say that God is totally unitary, that although other objects have properties, so here we're not disputing that there are properties, we're granting there are properties, but we're saying there's something special about God, whereby God doesn't really have any properties. When you list his properties, that's just an odd way of referring back to God again. There's a kind of mystical view, since it doesn't make any clear rational sense. It seems to confuse a property with a substance, and that's a category mistake. Whenever we say that an entity of one basic metaphysical category is the same as an entity of a wholly different basic metaphysical category, then we're mired in a serious category error. Can't possibly be right by any philosophical or rational criterion. I guess we can say, well, it may seem absurd, but the nature of God is something that's mysterious and beyond human comprehension, and so therefore it's okay. But notice I would make it okay to say that God both exists and doesn't exist at the same time as well. So if we're going to say those kinds of things, we're not really doing philosophy anymore. So it looks like there's a big problem for this kind of criterion. Now, there's an alternative interpretation of Descartes that reads these a little differently. So what it says is X is the alternative interpretation says X is a basic substance. By definition, is that X does not depend causally on anything else for its existence. In a non-basic substance, X does not depend causally on anything else for its existence except God. So this brings in the idea of causal dependence as opposed to just logical dependence. In the first interpretation, we were reading dependence as just logically entailing something. So we could say God's existence logically entails that there are these properties that he has: omnipotence, omniscience. These are all essential attributes of God. So there's a logical or metaphysical entailment. But here we're talking about, so to speak, what creates something, say, in terms of its causes, which is a whole different aspect of dependence. It's causal dependence as opposed to logical dependence. And that will change the implications of these definitions. So let's see if it helps. X does not depend causally on anything else for its existence except God. And then the last one will stay the same. It's a substance. If and only if, or by definition, it's either a basic substance or a non-basic substance. All right, so does the introduction of causal dependence help here? And suppose we should understand these in terms of a modal reading. So what I want to say here is that X is a basic substance if and only if it is possible for X to exist without being caused to exist. By anything else. And then X is a non-basic substance. We'll say it is possible for X to exist without being caused to exist by anything else except for God. It is possible for X to exist without being caused to exist. By anything else. Except God, something, it could depend on something else, but only in the case when it depends on God for a non-basic substance. So this would be the more precise way to put it. So a basic substance on this interpretation, causal interpretation, is a substance such that it's possible for it to exist without being caused to exist by anything else. Non-basic substance is something such that it's possible for it to exist without being caused to exist by anything else except God. And it's a substance if it's either a basic substance or a non-basic substance, as before. All right, so will this do any better? So how about the definition of a basic substance? That seems to stand up pretty well now, right? With this reading. Now the fact that God has to have properties and stuff doesn't disqualify him as a basic substance, because it doesn't seem like the qualities would have caused God to exist, right? Before it was sufficient to make a problem just that God's existence entailed the existence of other entities of any sort, and it did, it seemed, arguably, namely properties that he has that are other than him, like omnipotence and omniscience, so on. But now we're saying, is it possible for God to exist without being caused to exist by anything else? Well, yes. God wouldn't be created by anything else. That seems clear, right? God would be a necessarily existing being that creates other beings who have contingent existence. It seems, in at least most cases, perhaps in all. All right, so what about the definition of a non-basic substance? Says that it's possible for X to exist without being caused to exist by anything else except for God. So will that hold up? So take a non-basic substance like a table. Is it possible for it to exist without being caused by anything else except for God? I guess, yeah. But is it possible for it to exist without? I mean, could a table be made by God? I guess he's all powerful, right? Maybe that's not what normally happens, but that's why I put the "it is possible" in there. That strengthens the definition. So this might seem, on the face of it, to do better than the other interpretation of what Descartes' getting at. And I think the statements that he gives are ambiguous between the two. They could certainly be read this way. He talks about without the aid of any substance, not depending on any other entity. Those are certainly compatible with a causal reading of what he means by that, as opposed to a logical or metaphysical entailment reading, where we say that for something to be a substance is for it not, it's for its existence not to entail the existence of anything else or anything else, any other entity. So here we're talking about, is it possible for the substance X to exist without being caused to exist by anything else whatsoever, or anything else whatsoever except for God? So this seems to do better. But let's take a closer look. Is God the only necessary being? Right, so this definition presupposes that God's a necessary being and that there are other created beings who have contingent existence, like Adam and Eve. Right? So the beings that have contingent existence may exist and may not exist depending on the character of God's creation and what God brings about. Those are the contingent beings, but God is held to be a necessarily existing being, one who inhabits every possible world. Right? God exists in all possible worlds and exists at every time in every possible world. If a being were to fail to exist in any possible world, even for a nanosecond, that being wouldn't be a necessary being. Necessary being must exist in all worlds at all times. In those worlds, the necessary being exists. Can we think of other necessary beings, though? If there are, there may be trouble lurking in the wings. If those necessary beings aren't substances. because then it would be possible for them to exist without being caused to exist by anything else. If they exist necessarily also, how could they be created? You couldn't create something if it necessarily existed, right? That's why God doesn't have any creator, it seems. If there's some other necessary being or beings, then even God, it seems, couldn't create them because they'd already would exist. To create something is to bring something into existence, whereas prior to that creative act, it didn't exist, right? So if a being necessarily exists in all possible worlds at all times, it couldn't be created. Does that sound right? Nor could it be destroyed, right? So I offer for your consideration the following necessary being from set theory, the empty set, symbolized by this. It has nothing in it. It's called the null set. So it doesn't seem to depend on the existence of any member that it has or doesn't have. Doesn't depend on any member it has because it doesn't have any members. And its existence doesn't depend on any members it doesn't have because why would members that it doesn't have affect the existence of a set that has no members? If there exists a set that has no members to begin with, which is our hypothesis from set theory, which posits that there is such a set and that it necessarily exists in all possible worlds, it would exist in all possible worlds since it doesn't depend on anything for its existence. Even when there's nothingness, there's an empty set. When better, right? When nothing exists, the empty set sort of represents the state of affairs it obtains, and it still continues to exist when you start having things, pop into existence. It still exists as an abstract ideal of nothingness. So, so the empty set necessarily exists, so wouldn't it turn out to be a basic substance by this definition? It's possible for it to exist without being caused to exist by anything else, right? So the empty set turns out to be a basic substance, and that's horribly wrong because all substances are concrete individuals, like Rover and Adam and Eve and the table and so forth, and God. The empty set, though, is an abstract entity, so it couldn't be a concrete entity, and as any individual substance necessarily would be a concrete thing. So this definition then has the untoward result that the empty set turns out to be a basic substance. So that's not good. All right, so let's move on to some other attempts to explain what a substance is. Any other thoughts about this one? Yeah. So Descartes would have to assume that there's just one necessary being, basically, right? There'd be a similar problem with numbers, though generally most philosophers think that numbers turn out to be sets. Like 0 is the empty set, and 1 is a set containing 0, and so forth. 2 is a set containing 1, and on and on. All turns out to be based on the empty set. So if you think numbers are separate beings, then they too would provide a counterexample because they would turn out to be basic substances when they're abstract entities, not substantial objects. Yeah. No, I'm sure it's.
Could you, so empty set it exists because it's rely on anything, there's no members. in the set, but could you not claim that since it's an abstract thought, that in a literal sense, that it's a human with rational thought that created the empty set, and therefore it depends on that?
Yeah, well, that would be to adopt a conceptualist or kind of nominalist, extreme nominalist view of the empty set. It would have the consequence that set theory and arguably mathematics are creations of the human mind too. Now, some philosophers hold that view, but in our quest for ontological neutrality, it would be nice to have an account of substance that could accommodate both extreme nominalists and Platonists and Aristotelians. Yield the result that we have a substance regardless of what theory we settle on with respect to the problem of universals. So Descartes' view would at least have the problem that it's not it can't be correct if sets exist independently of the human mind. We can't settle that question today. I mean, we saw that there were arguments in favor of Platonic views of things. And I would say this, sets are thought to be better off with respect to nominalistic arguments than properties are, because it's argued by many nominalists that sets, even though they're abstract entities, are not universals, so they avoid many of the issues that arise with the idea of universals, which are somehow in many places at the same time, or stand in a indefinable relation of exemplification to things. Sets also have a pretty straightforward criterion of individuation, which is membership, whereas properties don't have that. So many modern-day nominalists, i.e. contemporary philosophers who reject the existence of universals, do accept the existence of sets as mind-independent entities, simply because they're better behaved than properties are. But one could reject them too. They are abstract, right? Even though they're not universals. They technically are particulars because a single set doesn't have any instances, right? So redness, dogness, say, has Rover, Fido, and Spot all having that same property. But there's nothing like that for sets. Sets just have elements and can be individuated in terms of their elements. So they're said to have extensional criteria of identity, whereas properties are held to be intentional with an S. Entities in that two properties like being a renate and being a chordate, a creature with kidneys and a creature with a heart, are different properties but are had by the very same things, because all creatures that have kidneys have hearts and all creatures that have hearts have kidneys. So the property picks out the very same instances, yet the properties are different. Whereas with a set, the set of renates and the set of chordates are just the very same set. We don't have two different properties. Or two different sets, right? They're one set, whereas with properties, there's two different properties. Having a heart, a creature with a heart property and a creature with a kidney property. And you could imagine possible worlds maybe where you have a creature with one organ and not the other, or something like that. Though that could be debated. But clearly they seem to be different properties because of the difference in the of what's represented in the content of that property. Sets don't have any content beyond their membership. And so when the members are the same, there's just one set, but not so to speak, for properties. So there's no general consensus on how to individuate properties. Sets all agreed on. It's very clean and logical. You just look at the elements, and if they match up, it's one set. Yeah, so this is a drawback to the Cartesian definition, but the second definition does seem better than the first. It still doesn't work. Okay, then there is Spinoza's famous definition of a substance. He was also an independence theorist. And he adopts a form of independence that's very extreme and strict for a substance. So Spinoza's idea is that there's only one substantial being in the world, which is the whole universe. He says the whole universe is the only substance, and everything else that we think of as a substance isn't. It's something that depends on the universe. So he doesn't think of the universe as being the sum of parts of the universe, but rather the parts as being abstractions from this single, indivisible universe entity. And he calls that universe God. So according to Spinoza, God signifies the universe as a single, indivisible substance. And things like human beings and tables, Rover, Fido, and Spot, and so on, are nothing but modes or properties of that being. So we're sort of like parts or states of this gigantic universal substance. See, the more Aristotelian way of thinking is in the reverse, right? That is, each of the things in the universe, each particle, each complex of particles is an individual substance, and the universe is a very abstract notion of the collection of all these substances. Right? Spinoza has it completely turned around the other way. There's just one substance. And these things we think of as autonomous individuals are not substances. They're, in fact, dependent modes or parts which we abstract from the universal substance. So we're sort of like waves in an ocean. The ocean is the substance, and the waves are dependent on the ocean. So he's just got one substance. And the things we often think of as individuals are just temporary stages or states or qualities or parts of the universal being or God. Of course, his is not a traditional notion of God, right? It's not of a being that is a thinking, conscious individual who's all-knowing, all-powerful, and completely good, and so forth. God, for Spinoza, is just the entire universe. He doesn't attribute to it a particular individual, a particular self-awareness or consciousness or personality or anything of that sort. God does have consciousness, but it's simply the consciousness of all of the parts of God that are conscious. And for Spinoza, that includes everything. He thinks of everything in the universe as having both extension and consciousness. So human beings, rocks, molecules, whatever. Each of these aspects of the universe manifests a degree of both extension and consciousness. He thinks of these two attributes as being inseparable from one another. Consciousness and extension, he says, are essences or attributes of any particular thing. So we see this in the case of a human being. A human being has both mental attributes and physical attributes. So Spinoza's got what's called a double aspect theory. But he's also a panpsychist in attributing mentality or thought to everything that exists in the universe. So his definition of substance, which is one of his fundamental concepts, is this. He says, by substance, I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. That is, he needs a that is to explain what he meant by that. That is, the conception of which, so he's saying the conception of a substance, does not require the conception of another thing from which it has to be formed. So what he's saying is that in conceiving of a substance, we don't have to conceive of anything else in order to form that conception of a substance. We can conceive of a substance just in itself, without having to think of anything else in order to form that conception. So such a substance would not only be causally independent of anything else, but it would be conceptually independent of anything else. So a substance cannot share its nature with anything else, because Spinoza argues if a substance shared its nature, and what's the nature of a substance? To be a substance, right? So if it shared that nature with anything else, then in order to conceive of one of the substances, you would thereby conceive of the other, because you'd be conceiving of a general concept which had application to more than one possible instance. So when thinking of one substance, you'd be opening the door to the possibility of other substances. And then in conceiving of one, you'd be conceiving of the other, which would violate the definition of a substance as that which can be conceived wholly through itself. So there can only be how many substances? One. You know, by his definitions and his logic, there can just be one substance. And what could that be except for the whole entire universe? Because if the universe was made of substances and was a collective of all substances, then in conceiving of the universe, you'd be conceiving of these other substances. So then the universe would turn out not to be a substance, because it wouldn't be conceived wholly in itself. So it must be that there's just one substance, and in conceiving of it, we don't conceive of any other substances. Therefore, the parts of that universal substance or God are not substances. He calls them modes. They are dependent beings on the substance, which makes them not substances. So Spinoza is really strong on this independence idea and takes it to an extreme logical conclusion that there's one and only one substance. Well, I guess that definition will be fine if we're willing to accept the consequence that there's just one substantial being, which is the entire universe. This seems to be totally at odds with our ordinary conceptions and notions of things, whereby each table here is an individual thing. So I guess it's sort of a irremediable parting of the ways here between Spinoza and our ordinary conceptual scheme. But it's not clear why we should accept Spinoza's radical conception of a substance as something not only which is independent of other things, but which is such that even in thinking of the thing, you can't think of anything else. Why go that far? I mean, it seems to be a departure from our ordinary notion of a substance to conclude that it's not even possible for there to be more than one. So. All right, so let us move on then to another theory known as the bundle or cluster theory of substance. The bundle theory says that a substance is a bundle of qualities. Is a bundle or collection of qualities. So one might call this the bundle theory or the cluster theory or collectionism. These kinds of terms are apt. But the basic idea is simply that. So take, for example, a particular object, like a particular apple. So this theory would say that the apple's an individual substance, and what that means can be unpacked as follows, that that apple is made up of a number of qualities. For example, its roundness, there's roundness and redness and sweetness and juiciness, right? All of these qualities. Suppose it has a worm in it, and it's also wormy, and so right? Be odd to find an apple that was juicy and sweet, and so, and it also had a worm in it, but it's possible if the worm just started, right? Burrowing in there right before you picked it out. Right? So it would have all these qualities, right? And so for the bundle theory, that's what the substance is. It's a clustering or grouping or bundle, right, of all these qualities that the thing has. And there's nothing more to it. There isn't some kind of like substantial substance stuff there or anything. It's just the qualities. So this is a way of reducing or eliminating substances in favor of qualities. The reductionist says there is a substance, but it reduces to a collection of qualities or a bundle of qualities. The eliminationist says there is no substance at all. All we have is a collection of qualities. So you see there's a difference. The eliminationist is out to eliminate substances from our ontology and say that there aren't any substances. So we can set that view to one side because we're assuming there are substances. I mean, why bother to analyze what a substance is if you don't think there could be any substances? So if we're inclined to take our folk ontological presupposition seriously, then the view we should be looking at within that context. That's not to say that eliminationism is not a view worthy of being discussed. It certainly is. But on that view, we're saying common sense is wrong. There are no substantial beings. What we mistake for substantial beings are in fact these clusters or bundles of qualities. The view that is being offered up as an alternative analysis of what a substance is, okay, is simply the view that a substance can be reduced to a collection of qualities. That there is a substance, but what we mean by a substance is no more than a collection of qualities. So I have some quotes here in the substance book. Okay, so David Hume here is an example of an eliminationist, at least when he said this. He says, as our idea of any body, a peach, for instance, is only that of a particular taste, odor, figure, size, consistency, etc., so our idea of any mind is only that of particular conceptions without the notion of anything we call substance, either simple or compound. See, so he's saying there's no notion of a substance at all. There's just notions of collections of particular qualities, tastes, figure, color, size, consistency, and so on. So that's eliminationism. There's nothing there that we should call a substance at all. That's just a mistaken notion that there are substances. Okay, an example of the reductionist view we can also find in Hume, which says there are substances and we can reduce them to these collections of qualities, which is the view I'm more interested in here, since we're exploring accounts of what a substance is, not accounts that explain why substances don't exist at all. Hume says, we have therefore no idea of substance distinct from that of a collection of particular qualities. Nor have we any other meaning when we either talk or reason concerning it. The idea of a substance, dot, 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 leaving out some stuff, is nothing but a collection of simple ideas. So the idea of a substance, right, is nothing but the idea of a collection of simple ideas that are united by the imagination and have a particular name assigned to them by which we're able to recall either to ourselves or to others that collection. So we name a particular collection, like Rover, collection of four-leggedness and furriness and brownness and carnivorousness and so on, right? We call that Rover, and then we're able to, in a handy, convenient way, right, call up that collection whenever we want to refer to Rover. But all we're referring to is this bundle of qualities. So that's an example of the reductionist. Substances do exist, but we can reduce them. They're no more than collections of qualities.
They both sound kind of like the psychological principle of prototype. You were saying, what is a shoe? Everyone kind of has an idea of what the same quality of a shoe is, but everyone in their mind has a different idea of, like, in their mind, what that shoe looks like. Right.
Yeah, you would say different people take as their sort of primary example or typical shoe or dog or whatever type of substance you might be referring to as their
default sort of.
Yeah, as their sort of initial paradigm. That's the word I'm searching for. So we have a paradigmatic shoe, the one that we had when we were, the first shoe that we got when we were, that we can remember, right, when we were 4.5 years old, that kind of thing. And then we model our thoughts about shoes on that. Yeah. Well, Hume, in fact, was one of the founders of sort of what you might call associationist psychology. He said he laid down certain principles of association among ideas, like resemblance, contiguity, cause and effect, and so on, which he could further break down into other ideas, right? And he thought we reason through associating ideas with one another and develop various psychological principles. He was hoping to develop laws of psychology in terms of these relationships among ideas that would parallel Newton's laws of physics. But it's not so easy to come up with any psychological laws along, that are analogous in being exceptionless, like the laws of physics. Very difficult. But to come up with any that aren't vacuous. At any rate, here's an example of reductionism from Bishop Berkeley, George Berkeley, who also held this view and was a predecessor of Hume. Berkeley says, and as several of these ideas are observed to accompany each other, they come to be marked by one name, and so to be reputed as one thing. Thus, for example, a certain color, taste, smell, figure, and consistency, having been observed to go together, are accounted one distinct thing signified by the name apple. Other collections of ideas constitute a stone, a tree, a book. Berkeley does make an exception for the self. He considers these things to just be collections of sense data or ideas, sensible ideas, like trees, books, and so on. And trees are even living things, right? They're not inanimate. But in the case of living entities like people, he categorizes us as souls, finite spirits. So he doesn't seem to get rid of the notion of substance altogether, because he leaves that one little area. It seems like God and finite soul, infinite souls and finite souls seem to still be substances, because he doesn't reduce them to collections of ideas. but everything else goes. For Hume's skeptical of God in the first place, and he sees no reason to introduce any notion of substance beyond that of these collections of qualities or ideas. All right. So some basic nomenclature and that we need to keep in mind. There's a question about both. There are questions about both the term collection and the term quality that have to be resolved on this kind of theory. Depending on how you interpret them, you get really different theories, different kinds of bundle theories. So on one view here, a collection is something like a set. So you'd have like a set of various qualities, quality 1, quality 2, and so on. This seems to be an unfortunate use of the term collection, though, because it would turn out that these substances, if they're collections and collections are sets, these substances would turn out to be abstract objects. But substances, as we've emphasized, are concrete things. So I think we don't want to use the notion of a collection understood as a set for these theories, because they'll be trivially false by virtue of having committed, again, a category mistake of identifying a substance with a set. So better to think of a collection as a thing which has parts rather than elements. So if we think of a collection as a set, we're saying that the collection has members or elements. But we could think of a collection like a collection of postage stamps, which is a thing that has various parts. Each of the postage stamps is a part of the collection of postage stamps. So if we think of collections as entities that have parts, then we won't be conceiving of them as sets. So if we say the stamp is an element of a certain collection, then we're thinking of the collection as a set. But if we say the stamp is a part of a collection, we'll be thinking of it not as a set, but as a grouping or sum of objects. So in metaphysics nowadays, we distinguish between two notions of a collection as a set theoretical notion and a collection as a mereological or summative notion. So if we think of, say, this book plus this book, and we sum them together, we get this collection of books, and it has each book as a part. The collection wouldn't exist unless the books did. The collection doesn't have elements, it just has parts. It has the two books as parts. This seems to be a more concrete notion of what a collection is. And so by Occam's razor, it seems to be a less exotic and ontologically, seems less ontologically problematic than the notion of a set theoretical collection anyway. So we could understand Berkeley and Hume and so forth as just speaking of sums of qualities. So that's probably the way to go. Then we don't have this untoward consequence that we turn out to be abstract sets. Seems peculiar. Okay. The other thing has to do with the interpretation of qualities. So how are we going to understand what a quality is? Here too we have a distinction, right, between those who think of qualities as abstract entities, as universals of some sort, and those who think of qualities as concrete particulars or tropes. So which would be the better view for the bundle theorist, do you think? To say that substances are collections of abstract qualities, or they're collections of concrete particular, spatiotemporal concrete particular qualities, like a particular redness, a particular squareness, a particular odor, a particular taste, and so on. Remember, the substance that they're trying to reduce is itself a concrete particular, which has a causal interaction with other particulars. Abstract entities don't have these kinds of causal interactions with things. So which would be the better way to go? Concrete, right? Wouldn't that make more sense to say that an apple is the sum of these concrete qualities of a particular redness and a particular sweetness and a particular roundness and a particular tastiness and a particular shininess and worminess and so on, right? It would make sense to say it's the sum of all those particular qualities rather than some abstract qualities. For one thing, if you remember that contra-Leibnizian universe where you have two exactly similar objects, right? They would turn out to be the very same object on the universalistic view. If we use universals and we say that this sphere is the sum of all of the universals it has, and this sphere is the sum of all the universals it has, then we're back to Leibniz's view that there can only be one sphere. Seems like you can have an infinite number of them, right, that are all exactly alike in different places. Leibniz says, well, God wouldn't waste his time creating such a world, but how do we know that there is a God who can't waste his time creating a world like that, right? It might just randomly happen that there's a world like that. There seems to be no contradiction or inconsistency in conceiving it. We don't want to rule that out then, it seems, by assuming that a substance is a sum of universals. If we say that a substance is a sum of particular qualities, we don't have a problem anymore, because this sphere, which is exactly like this one, each of them has particular qualities that exactly resemble one another, but they're numerically distinct particular qualities. This one has this set of particular qualities. This one has this set of differently located particular qualities, and the two sets of particular qualities can be mapped onto each other in virtue of having an exact resemblance. So the shape of this sphere exactly resembles the shape of that sphere, and so on. These are now particulars that exactly resemble each other and not universals. So it looks like it makes much more sense to identify a concrete substance with a sum of concrete particular qualities or tropes, which would then be the preferred analysis. And if you read what Hume and Berkeley say, they seem to be talking about substances as sums of concrete particular entities, which they describe in terms of vivid sensory apprehensions, like the particular taste, the particular size, and so on. So clearly they're talking about particulars. They may think of them as sense data rather than as tropes, but that's a very small difference, because if you think about what a trope of redness would be and what a sense datum of redness would be, it's hard to really see what the difference is supposed to be between the two. We could go either way with that. Hume calls these particulars impressions. Berkeley calls them sensible ideas, and contemporary philosophers prefer the trope terminology since it's free of any mentalistic associations. It's probably preferable. Okay, so next time we will look at how defensible the view is that this book here is a sum of these particular tropes, the particular rectangular solidity, the particular redness, the particular solidity, the particular weight or mass, the particular consistency or solidity of the book, and so on. We'll see if that view can be defended. One of the big issues that arises with respect to the bundle theory, I'll give you in advance notice of that, is understanding exactly what it is that connects the qualities to each other. This already comes out in the term bundle, because a bundle always has to have what? Some kind of like rope or something around it, like a bundle of sticks. Has to have something around it sort of to hold the bundle together. And the same seems to be true if we're going to understand a book or any other individual substance as a sum of particular qualities. Something's going to have to tie those particular qualities to each other. Otherwise, you have the danger of randomly scattered or haphazardly scattered random collections of qualities turning out to be substances, like the sound of a jet plane, the shape of the book, the taste of a particular onion in China, and the color of a rose in Mrs. Smith's backyard, and so on. That these random scattered qualities constitute some kind of individual substance, which seems quite ridiculous and absurd. So we'll be examining this question of bundle theories of substance and the problem of the unity of their qualities next time.